So when Grant comes in, I realize you guys aren't going to be able to see this. So if you look in the upper left of your picture, your screen, you're going to see Kentucky. And right across the river here, the Cumberland River, is the Ohio River, and that's Illinois. See this? So he's going to come down from Cairo, Illinois. That's how you pronounce that, not Cairo. And he's going to be given a command of a unit here in Illinois. And his primary objective is to sever Tennessee in half, cut Tennessee in half. So what he's got to do is fight along these crucial rivers. By the way, his army is going to be called the Army of the Tennessee. That's not Army of the State of Tennessee. That's Army of the Tennessee River. Okay. Remember, the Union armies are usually named after a body of water. The Union Army of the East, the Army of the Potomac. So he's going to come down, and if you look right here, right below the state line of Kentucky and Tennessee, you see Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, just west of Nashville. And Grant is going to launch a surprise attack on them and overwhelm both forts. And that is where he first gets his name, so to speak. Then he's going to proceed south along the Tennessee River to this location here on the border of Mississippi. So this is Mississippi, where it says Shiloh. So if you're looking over here, you'll see at the time it was the bloodiest battle in the Civil War. Now, it would later be replaced, of course. This is the spring of '62. Later, Antietam would be even worse. But at Shiloh, he's camped just across the border in Tennessee, and General Albert Sidney Johnston, he's the commander of the Confederacy in the West. General A.S. Johnson launches a surprise attack on Grant. All right, and he pushes Grant back. You see the blue arrows? This is north, so he's pushing Grant back. During the battle, Johnston gets shot in the leg, and it severs his artery in his femoral artery, and he will die. And that's like Robert E. Lee level high general dying. He's the highest person in both sides of the war to be killed. He's like the commander of the whole army of the West, and he's killed in battle by being shot in the leg. Grant will initially fall backwards, but overnight, the Army of the Ohio River arrives with him. And the next day, he launches a full assault on the Confederates and drives them back into Mississippi. So, and this is a brutal battle. It's in a peach orchard, and there's blossoms floating around over corpses. It's just really, really terrible battle. You can see here, it's almost 24,000 casualties between the Union and Confederacy. But Grant wins. His counterattack. By the way, you see this name Breckinridge down here? This is the Breckinridge that ran for president. Remember him for the Southern Democrats in 1860? So Johnston is killed. These guys fall back. This is General Bragg. He's one of the worst Confederate generals. Usually the Confederacy has really good generals. Bragg turns out to be terrible. He's from North Carolina. That's why Virginia is always cooler than North Carolina, right? I don't mean to brag. But nonetheless, they push the Confederates back into Mississippi. He severed the western part of Tennessee from the rest of Tennessee, okay? And then that sets the stage for the most important campaign in the West. So if you can think about the Confederacy, they have to control the Mississippi River. Like, it's essential. And when Grant came down, and Lake Shiloh would be right above here, okay? Grant recognizes that in Mississippi, there is a strategic location that controls the entire Mississippi River. Now, at this point, if you know anything about the map, I'll go ahead and take you over here. The Union has actually taken New Orleans under the command of Admiral Farragut, and they've been marching up the Mississippi. See that? See the blue line there? Grant is coming down the Mississippi. But the problem is, right in the middle is this big S-shaped curve. See it right here? And no ship or boat can get around this without going past this town that sits on bluffs overlooking that spot. So it controls every part of the river. And the name of this, it's really a fort at this point, is Vicksburg. Okay? So there's this position and this big curve. Now, he wins this battle at Milliken's Bend, but rather than go directly across, he can't deal with Vicksburg directly. So he comes below Vicksburg and then starts moving across Mississippi. And you can see he has engagements at Fort Gibson and Raymond and Jackson. And then he attacks Vicksburg from the east. See that? But Vicksburg, like I said, it sits up on a cliff. And so he can't really launch a frontal assault against that. So he pulls a page out of like medieval times. He lays Vicksburg to siege. The men in Vicksburg, they bomb it, they shell it, there's no food coming into it. People are eating rats, they're digging in caves. So Vicksburg is literally under siege. And finally, after 2 months, all right, after being there for 2 months, Vicksburg surrenders. And they surrender, and Grant moves in on July 3rd and 4th, 1863. So if you're doing any calculations of a calendar, July 3rd, 1863 is the day that both Vicksburg and Gettysburg fall. The battles happen, or the battle's been going on in Vicksburg. Both battles end on the 4th of July weekend, 1863. How cool is that, right? Independence Day. So Vicksburg gives up. And with that, Grant has helped accomplish the Anaconda Plan. Remember, one of the goals of the Anaconda Plan is to sever the 3 western states and gain control of the Mississippi River. Well, that's now happened. The Union has full control of the Mississippi. Grant had become relatively unpopular in Congress. Lots of Washington politicians did not like Grant. Grant smoked about 14 cigars a day. He would later die of throat cancer, by the way, after being president. He developed cancer from it. He was known to be a drinker. They wanted to fire him for being drunk. Lincoln famously says, find out whatever whiskey he drinks and send it to every one of my generals. All right? And he would tell other politicians, I cannot spare this man. He is a fighter. You understand? So Grant was kind of unpopular amongst the political crowd, but he's become a hero in America. Like, they know who this guy is. It's a perfect example. Patton. He's kind of like Patton, kind of a rough and tumble guy. Well, Patton was actually pretty well educated. He was a blue blood. Grant's not. Grant's from like the lower sorts. The thing about Grant, there's a new book out that I have about President Grant. And I'll just tell you all this now. It's the same author who did, and I had a couple biographies of Grant, but none like this. The same guy who wrote the biography of Hamilton that the musical was made about wrote a biography of Grant. And this biography has helped redefine who Grant is. After the Civil War, most of the history books about the Civil War were written by Southerners. So how do you think they depicted Grant? As a drunken idiot, right? A drunken ape, a drunken buffoon. Well, that turned out to be extremely exaggerated. All right. In other words, these former Southerners, so to speak, these Southern historians, make Grant out to be a really bad guy. Today, we now know that that's a mixed story. Like, it's not nearly as bad as critics would say. Nonetheless, he's a successful general, and the only real successful general at the time in the Union Army. Right? Like, nobody else is winning these big battles with Grant. Now, Grant was helped by the success of the American Navy. And so there are 2 major naval engagements led by Admiral Farragut. This is Admiral David Farragut. The first is the Battle of New Orleans, which you see down here. And this is not to be confused with the War of 1812, but it's a naval engagement that helps land a group of ground force in Louisiana. And the second is the little bit of Confederate Navy ships they can put together, Navy vessels, is engaged in the Battle of what's called Mobile Bay. This is Mobile, Alabama. And after the Battle of Mobile Bay, the entire Gulf Coast is completely controlled by the Union. So the Confederacy, you can see, is dying. The West has been cut off. They are completely blockaded. There's only one port left in the entire South that's still open. That's Wilmington. And so, they're really struggling. And so you definitely should be familiar with these two. Now, this is Grant's chief lieutenant, chief second in command. This is his Stonewall Jackson, so to speak. His name is William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman, when Grant goes south to Vicksburg, Sherman goes east. Okay? So Sherman is going to go to Chattanooga, and they're going to fight a battle there called the Battle of the Clouds. It's fought in the hills that ring around Tennessee City, Chattanooga. And and he's going to win it. He's going to defeat the Texan John Bell Hood. Then he's going to move towards this city. And so so what Sherman's goal is to get to the sea. It's called March to the Sea, right? He wants to sever the rest of the southern, the deep south, and then engage in what is called, and this is really he is the pioneer of this, total war. So this is the fella who, as he goes through the Confederacy, destroys all the crops. What few railroads there are, his men will pull up the railroad ties, superheat them, and wrap them around trees, so they'll never be able to be used again. So he wages war on the entire southern population. By the way, he's the most hated general in the South. All right, Sherman's a dirty word in Georgia. Okay, so as he's moving through the South, he's also, by the way, liberating slaves. Like the slaves are pouring into his area. They're following the army as he marches from Tennessee through Mississippi and through Alabama and Georgia. So as he moves through Georgia, he lays initial siege to Atlanta, and Atlanta falls right before the election. You guys see this? Look at the date, September, the election's in November, right? The fall of Atlanta will be a huge boost to President Lincoln. He's going to get a kind of political boost. Every time the Union wins, it's good for Lincoln, obviously. And so this will be a sort of gift for Lincoln for the election. And then if you look, he keeps scorching his way through, and this is also called scorched earth. He leaves nothing behind for the Confederates to survive on. He's just and the book makes a really good argument that I agree with based on what I've read. They say that Sherman's style of warfare, total war, actually saves lives. Now, how would this type of warfare save lives, people ask? Because it ends the war much quicker. In other words, this will utterly cripple the Confederate ability to wage war. And so it's kind of like dropping a nuke on Japan. That actually saved millions of people's lives because they stopped. Okay, we're done. All right, so by doing this, the Confederacy not only can't supply themselves, this is the last area where they can get crops and stuff from, but they also lose their will to fight, because if you're up in Virginia fighting the Yankees and your home has been set on fire in Georgia, where do you want to be? Georgia. Right. And so the Confederacy is shrinking and people are deserting. And so Sherman is being effective here. And then he reaches Savannah, December 21st, and presents this city as a gift to Abraham Lincoln for Christmas. All right, it's a Christmas present. So the 1-2 punch of Atlanta and Savannah have utterly decimated. And so you can see, now, by the way, by this point, and I don't want to undersell the significance of these battles, but at this point, the Confederacy are fighting a rearguard action with the battle. They're basically retreating before Sherman's army. The only last major battle they have to take is Wilmington, and this is a naval battle primarily. Okay, so as you can see here, they're moving through the Deep South, and Sherman's just annihilating everything in his path. So that's 64. By 65, April, the war is going to be over. All right. So here again is an idea of how it's shrinking. So you start, this is the very first phase of the war. These are the border states. So the border states already were under, Lincoln and the Union's control, but much of the region were still in sort of rebellion. Makes sense? They didn't vote to secede, but there are a lot of areas around here that were kind of tricky. But when you see this line right here, 62 and 62, and then 63, by 63, there were battles in Texas. I don't want to say like nothing happened in Texas and Louisiana. By the way, a lot of southern plantation owners, like the big planters, are going to move to Texas during the Civil War. It's like an evacuation to here. They feel like that's safe because the plantations are in danger. So nonetheless, by the end of the war, the Deep South has been cut off. Keep in mind, you can't go anywhere water-wise. And so this is where Robert E. Lee is, right? This is where General Joseph Johnston is, okay? This is Sherman. And up here, you have Grant in the purple area, right? So that you're seeing how the end game is developing. It's either going to be the defeat of Virginia area or from the South, they're going to get one way or the other, okay? So at home, let's talk about back up in Washington. So don't forget, now keep in mind, it's during this period in America, we're passing the Homestead Act. for passing the Pacific Railroad Act. Who's completely in charge? Now, they did lose some seats in the midterm elections in 1862, but still deeply in charge are the Republican Party. You know, the Republican Party is overwhelmingly the team, right? The problem is throughout the war, a Republican Congress committee. So when it says joint committee, that means it was made up of senators and congressmen. The Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War investigated the war. Like they're making sure that whatever the contracts aren't fraudulent. They're making sure these are the guys that oversee the generals a lot. When I was telling you that they wanted to get rid of Grant, these are some of the guys that wanted to get rid of Grant. Okay, and they're often the reasons why you got these generals who were appointed who were not very good because they were politically friends and allies of these people. So Congress was getting their friends in there. But Grant wasn't a friend of any of these guys. But by far the most important two people to know is this guy, Salmon P. Chase, at least for this part, and Ben Wade. Now, Chase is the guy trying to pay for the war. You understand? Remember when we talked about greenbacks and we talked about, you know, the National Banking Act and all of those economic programs are Chase's. Now, he wanted to be president too. He was one of the many people in Lincoln's cabinet who had run for president, and he was not very fond of President Lincoln. He always thought he was kind of like Lincoln's superior. Stanton, the Secretary of War, kind of was like that. And normally, you don't let the cabinet kind of be ugly to the president. Lincoln was pretty chill about that. You know, he kind of joked about it because he needs these people. So he's allowing them a little more insubordination than you would normally get. But he's the guy overseeing the economic plan and is often critical of Lincoln. But this fellow, Ben Wade, is the guy who's angry about the way the war is being prosecuted. He wants the Southerners to be treated like conquered province. You know, in other words, kind of what Sherman ends up doing. Okay, and so what happens is he's perceived as it's not enough to win the war. The radical position is to punish the South. So everybody hear that? It's like if you were playing a football game and your team wins 21-7. All right, it's a tough game. We won with 2 touchdowns. We feel good. So some coaches are like, beat them 98-0. They just want to obliterate them, right? And that's kind of the radicals' position. They want to utterly annihilate the South. They want to drive out everything that caused the Civil War. So they're going to be the guys, the radicals, in charge after Lincoln is killed. So that's important to remember, all right? Because Lincoln's not a radical. He wants to end the war, but he's not trying to destroy the South in the process. Okay? Now, one of the things that was a huge setback for Lincoln and for, I think, America was the death of Stephen Douglas. Douglas died in the beginning of the war, in June of 1861. But Douglas repeated, by the way, after Douglas lost the election, he then spent the next 7 months trying to keep the war from happening and supporting Abraham Lincoln. If you want to talk about politics being an interesting game, here's the guy who ran against Lincoln, a Democrat, who once Lincoln got elected was completely supportive of. So that word would be bipartisan. You understand? We don't see that in America currently. Hopefully we'll see it, you know, but I haven't seen it in years, so I don't expect it to start all this. And here are some direct quotes from him. By the way, his getting typhoid fever is a result of his heavy campaign across the country to support the war effort, you know, to support Lincoln. So in other words, he was out there rallying the Democrats to support the war. Keep in mind, Democrats were peace Democrats, a lot of them, right? So we might even consider Douglas a war Democrat, meaning he wanted the Union preserved at all costs. These are 2 quotes I yanked out for y'all. There can be no neutrals in the Civil War, only patriots and traitors. You know, so if you're trying to sit it out as a Northerner, you're a traitor, all right? You all know I'm a good partisan. That means I'm a good Democrat in partisan times. And I trust you'll find me equally good patriot when the country's in danger. I've said from the very beginning of this pandemic, this should not be a partisan issue. There should not be Republicans and Democrats squabbling over how to solve the pandemic. Like, it is a national health crisis, right? National security implication. Well, a civil war is a national security implication, right? So he's saying, yeah, when it comes to debating whether or not we should have high tariffs or not, I'm going to be a what? I'm a partisan when it comes to arguing tariffs. I have a belief. Tariffs should be low, right? But when it comes to supporting America at the war, and so by losing Douglas, this is a major setback because that means the Democrats don't have their strongest leader encouraging them to support the Republican administration. You understand? Like they need that. Instead, they end up with this. They end up with overt anti-Lincoln rhetoric, overt anti-war effort. And so they're called copperheads by their critics. Landingham actually becomes the subject of a book. A book is written about him called it's a fictional book, but he's the main character, called The Man Without a Country, because he is so openly supportive of the South that he is exiled from America. He's banished. He goes to Canada, then he comes back down. But by this point, the war is over and he's unpopular, but he's from Ohio. But you can see here, and again, I take you back to the clips from the draft riots. We have this perception of Abraham Lincoln being sort of revered as the figure on the Lincoln Memorial, right? But during the Civil War, there were a large segment of the northern population that viewed him not well, okay? But viewed him critically. And so Lincoln was very concerned about the incoming election. There's an election in 1864. Now, the Dems do a very smart thing. They nominate George McClellan. Now, why is this smart? Because he speaks as a military veteran. And by the way, McClellan was great at explaining that he didn't lose at all. It was Lincoln's fault that he was fired and stuff like that. And so McClellan promised what? Peace. Lincoln, you get the what and what? Draft and ruin, right? So Lincoln is going to pull a really smooth political move. For a brief moment in time, the Republican Party is going to cease to exist for one election. Instead, he is going to form a Union Party. Hear that? So he actually runs on, I know it says right here Republican, but in fact, that's not what the ballot will say. He is not going to be a Republican officially in 1864. He's going to be a Union. Now, by the way, the Union Party is nothing but this election. So don't let it be like what happened to the Union Party. It's this election. So who are the Union Party? They are Republicans and war Democrats. He actually includes, including his vice presidential candidate, a Democrat, but a Democrat who supports the war effort. He puts on the ticket the only senator from a southern state who refused to secede. Andrew Johnson is a U.S. senator from Tennessee. He is a Southern states' rights Democrat who did not agree with secession. And during the war, he had actually been helpful to Lincoln. And we're going to talk a lot more about Andrew Johnson later, because he becomes president. But nonetheless, he makes this sort of pseudo party made up of the Republicans and war Democrats. And that leaves the rest of the Democrats, these so-called peace Democrats, voting for McClellan. Okay? Voting for McClellan. Lincoln is not sure he's going to win. He actually thinks it's possible he'll lose this election. The fall of Savannah was a huge, the fall of Atlanta was a huge boost, but he's not sure. So here's the outcome. Now keep in mind the Confederate states don't vote at all. So it doesn't look like he had a problem, does it? Nope. No, it looks like he wins pretty comfortably. He doesn't win Kentucky and New Jersey and Delaware. All right? But this is a little deceptive. Okay? Look at the popular vote, right? And then look at who voted for who. So this comes from a newspaper. Actually, it's a periodical, a weekly periodical. At the time, Lincoln v. McClellan. It's in Harper's Weekly, right? With 78% of the Union electorate casting ballots, Lincoln was reelected in a landslide, it says. It even says a 55% popular vote was the third largest in the history. But then it goes on to say, McClellan only wins New Jersey, Delaware, and Kentucky. Republicans, by the way, who are Republicans? Farmers, that's who they've always been. Western farmers, not Southern farmers. All right? Skilled workers, New Englanders, young voters, and there he says it. Guys, this is very, very important. He gets 80% of the vote of the Union military, right? And there is some debate that those guys got kind of loose when it came to voting. So, for example, their entire company would have one guy go vote for them, and he would vote for the entire company. So he'd cast like 100 ballots. You understand? So that might have been influential. So, but nonetheless, I would argue that this guy right here is maybe exaggerating this, and that Lincoln needed who to help him get elected? The soldier vote. That's not unusual for the soldiers to vote for the commander-in-chief when they're winning. But I do think it's important that you consider them in the popular vote, because that's hundreds of thousands of people voting like this, right? So he says the figure was not necessary for his reelection, or perhaps the margin of victory in some close states. More importantly, it's very symbolic because Republicans kept control of the House and the Senate, state legislatures, and every governorship of New Jersey. So Lincoln wins, and he wins comfortably, but you know, having the Union vote from the military certainly plays a role in this. And I would be familiar with that. I would know that the military helped play a decisive factor in electing him. Okay. Now, I would also point out, and let's go to the textbook just to make sure I don't omit anything, you know, because I'm prone to not always remembering what all is in the textbook. If you look here, you know, it talks about the campaign, and then it talks about the president pulled through, but nothing more than necessary was left to chance. At election time, many Northern soldiers were furloughed home to support Lincoln. One veteran voted 49 times for him and his company. Soldiers were able to vote at the battlefield, literally. And so that's who I think most gets credit for electing Lincoln during this election. Okay, and McClellan did very well in terms of popular votes, but you know, clearly the Democrats are not going to win in the North with Lincoln in charge. Okay, but make sure you know that election. It is an unusual one. General McClellan, you know, being the former commander, now running against the president. Okay, so let's move now to the last year of the war. All right, actually, before we fight the last year of the war, I want to choose the second most important speech ever given by Abraham Lincoln, one of the most important speeches ever given, period. So the most important speech, which we talked about yesterday, was the Gettysburg Address. Gettysburg Address is a 2-minute speech that sums up in really beautiful language what it means to be American. You know, it's gorgeous. Now, this is a pretty interesting read too. So let me darken the background and maybe it'll pop out better, because this is pretty light. Can y'all, I don't know if y'all can read this or not, but it seems light to me. Let's try that. And then I'll tell you what we can do. Give me a second. Not that color. Not that color. Well, I thought I had it. What's going on? Okay. Let me do it again here. I don't like the way that's showing up. So let's take a look at what he had to say. And I'll try to enlarge this as big as I can, because unlike the Gettysburg Address, this one is larger. And, you know, we had an inaugural address just the other day. Very unusual inaugural address, probably by the area and stuff. But presidents' inaugural addresses are their moment to really say something that will be remembered forever. These are like immortalized. Lincoln's first inaugural address, they had to sneak him into Washington. They had to put an old lady's like blanket over him and stuff because he was in danger of being killed. That's not the case here. Still speaking under the unfinished Capitol dome, though. So very symbolically looking at that. But it's an interesting speech. So I want to take a moment and really explore it. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, so last time I gave an inaugural address, all thoughts were directed to an impending civil war. I do think it's interesting that, you know, Southerners after the war is over are not going to like the word Civil War. They're going to call it the war between the states, or they're going to call it the war of northern aggression, right? But you know, Civil War is what he calls it. All dreaded it, all sought to stop it. Both parties didn't want war. right? But one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive. And the other would accept war rather than let it perish. So therefore, war came, right? We were not willing to agree, so we fought. 1/8. So look at what he chooses to talk about as his major point of his second inaugural. 1/8 of the American population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the whole country, but found in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. We know why the war was fought. It was fought over slaves. To strengthen, perpetuate, and keep this group of people being able to control slaves was the object for which the insurgents would tear the Union apart by war. While the government claimed no right to do more than stop the spread of slavery, restrict the margin of it, neither party expected for the war the magnitude. They didn't expect how big or how long. I mean, remember, it's 90-day enlistment. Yeah, exactly. Okay? Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease. I didn't know slavery would be over at the end of this conflict. That was not Lincoln's intent. He didn't start the Civil War to end slavery, right? Or even before the conflict should cease with slavery end. You might have 13th Amendment's been done. Each looked for an easy win and a result less fundamental and astounding. Both, and I love this, man, because he's talking about how we're the same people, North and South. Both read the same Bible, prayed to the same God, and asked for his aid fighting the other. It may seem strange that any man should ask a fair God's help in taking money from the sweat of other men. But then he drops a, by the way, Lincoln was probably, at least as a young man, an agnostic. He even wrote a treatise against religion, against organized religion, that he never published. One of his friends said, if you publish that, you'll never get elected for anything. But by the time he was president, he seems to have evolved into a religious guy. His language is full. And he'd read the Bible growing up, but he usually didn't talk religiously. But once he was president, you start to see almost like the pastor Abraham Lincoln, right? And here's what he says. He's talking about God, right? And then he goes with, let us judge not, that we be not judged. So, hey, slavery, I'm not going to judge them, okay? The prayers of both groups could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. And here's where this, by the way, this document is on the other side of the Lincoln Memorial. So if you walk into the Lincoln Memorial and you're looking at Honest Abe up there on the hill, the steps, kicking his foot out kind of thing. 1 minute. Anyway, Lincoln's sitting there. On his right is the Gettysburg Address. And on his left is the second inaugural. It's on the walls of it. So that's how big this stuff is. God has his own purpose. Woe, now he's quoting scripture here. Woe unto the world. By the way, when he gave that house divided itself cannot stand line in the Lincoln Douglas debate, that's from the Bible too. So he was often prone to using biblical lines. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come. But woe to that man whom the offense cometh. So what he's saying, okay, I'll let him say. If we shall suppose that slavery is an offense, which in the will of God must happen, but which having continued through his time, he now wants gone. God wants it gone, he said, right? And that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the misfortune due to those who had slaves. Shall we then discern any departure from God as, divine attributes that people that believe in him? Okay? In other words, God is a just God, right? And if it's time for slavery to end, this is why we're paying for it, right? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this scourge of war will pass away, right? Fast, let's get over with. Here it is. This is the line that people quote. Yet God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by these slaveholders, 250 years of making slaves work without getting paid. So in other words, all the money that slavery ever created, okay, in 250 years shall be paid for by us in this war. This war is going to cost 250 years of slavery, so be it, right? And every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, fighting to pay for the cost of the blood of slave ownership, right? As was said 3,000 years ago, The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. We are paying the price as a nation for slavery in blood and in treasure, right? But it's whose will, he says. God's will. And then he closes with the language that is supposed to be conciliatory, unifying, bringing the nation back together. This is crucial. Malice towards none and charity for all. That's the line. That's what everybody does. Malice towards none and charity for all. That means we're not going to be angry at Robert E. Lee when the war is over. We're not going to be angry at Jefferson Davis when the war is over. That's malice. We're not going to be angry at women who used to own slaves. That's charity. Right? With firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work which we are in. To bind up the nation's wound. He's talking about healing. To care for him who shall have borne the battle, soldiers, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with other nations. Lincoln, in his inaugural address, says slavery had to end because it was God's will. And that the Civil War is the sort of karma of 250 years of slaveholding. You know, we're going to kill hundreds of thousands of Americans as a result of slavery. Okay? So that's a huge part of this question, I think, is that Lincoln wants to heal the nation now. But he's still got a war to finish. And Lee has been winning, right? So here's what he's talking about. The Civil War, before the war even ended, slavery had been abolished. Okay? So make sure you're aware of that. And that's the official end of slavery in America. I will point out just a sort of sidebar. There are some people in America who believe the 13th Amendment should be revised because they do not like the part where it says, except as punishment for crime. Because in America, the American prisoner population is often compelled to do labor. And there are people who are like, that shouldn't really be something you make people do, so to speak. But it is constitutionally protected. You can, in essence, enslave prisoners, you know, because they are duly convicted under the law, so to speak. Now, Nicholas, to answer your question, it wasn't a large percentage of the population. It was a large percentage of the voting population. These are men who had suffrage rights. You know, half the population are women. They can't vote at all. Northern African Americans in the North couldn't vote at that point either. Freedom. So yeah, they were a sizable percentage of the voting population. I guess would be the best answer. You know, you're talking about over 1 million voters, kind of thing. So yeah, it had influence. I don't know the exact numbers of how it shaped up in terms of whether or not it was just because of the the soldiers that Lincoln won, but it's certainly influential. So this is the last year of the war. Grant has been spectacularly successful. So naturally, after the failure to pursue Lee, right? Remember Meade, Gettysburg, he is replaced, as is often the case. And Grant is brought in to the east, where the big game is. You know, this is like a prime time. And so Grant has a plan to defeat Robert E. Lee. The problem is the American people are going to have a really hard time stomaching the plan. Grant's nickname is going to be Grant the Butcher, because what Grant does is completely different from what any other Union general has done. When he loses to Lee, Lee will still have to relocate, right? Grant will pursue him every battle. So every time Grant and Lee engage, they are going to relocate. They're going to move that. And Grant says, I intend to fight on this line if it means all summer. All summer long, we're going to fight. And so some military historians compare Grant to a bulldog or a pit bull. You know, pit bulls have been bred so that their jaw, when it latches onto another dog, it locks. So you can shoot a pit bull in the head and its jaws won't open. Right? They're just locked, right? Well, Grant locks on to Lee. And what advantage does Grant have that Lee doesn't? Soldiers. So Grant can keep attacking Robert E. Lee, losing huge casualties, and still proceed to attack him again. And so Lee doesn't have replacement troops. He's bottom of the barrel here. You know? So these are the first battles now of the Grant campaign. Virginia campaign. So this battle takes place just east of where the Battle of Chancellorsville is. I mean, just west, excuse me, where the Battle of Chancellorsville. Here's Chancellorsville. See it? So they're still dealing with the Rappahannock River, back there again. And this is in the woods, sort of southwest of Chancellorsville. By the way, there is an attempt to build a Walmart on it that I helped donate money to try to stop. I think there's nothing more despicable than putting a Walmart in the middle of a Civil War battlefield, right? Manassas has a water park right outside the entrance of it. And I think as much as I'm not a person who is all celebratory of Confederate generals, I am deeply, deeply committed to preserving Civil War history. Like, we need to study this history. Like, that's because it's an essential part of American history. So nonetheless, that's the Walmart right here. But this battle is called the Wilderness because it actually takes place, it's the only battle that I can think of, in a forest. So it's heavily, densely wooded, okay? It's forested. Here's Grant. You can see Meade has been demoted. Down here is Lee. Longstreet is his other key general. And they're going to fight, and really it's a mixed bag battle. Lee doesn't lose, but he can't maintain his position. In other words, you see where this is called the bloody angle. You see how it sticks out right here? Grant's going to hurl corps after corps into this area. Burnside up here, Hancock down here, and they're just going to get mowed down. In the night of the battle, the second night, there are going to be fires that break out in the woods because of the battle, right? Gunpowder and stuff. People who were wounded are going to burn alive in the woods. They're going to hear screams of people burning up in this forest. All right, and so this wilderness battle is absolutely terrible. The outcome is, if you look at it on numbers, Grant is outperformed by Lee. Lee, his men do better. But Lee has to give up the field. Like, he can't stay there if Grant just keeps attacking, his men will die. So this wilderness battle, as you can see here, huge casualties. Above Chancellorsville, below Chickamauga, which is in Tennessee, River Gap, and Gettysburg here. So lots and lots of casualties. Not a decisive battle in terms of the end of the war or the victory being Grant's, but unfortunately, Grant, is, from Lee's perspective, is not going anywhere. So Lee is stymied, and Lee didn't really know Grant well. Lee had only met Grant once. He met him in the Mexican War. He didn't know him, and so he knew these other generals, so he could out-strategize them. And so this is a new type of problem for him, to fight Grant and then have Grant still there. So Lee has to, as Grant said, relocate. And you can see it kind of here in these yellow lines. Now keep in mind, here's Richmond, right? And Richmond's heavily defended. That's what these are. And Grant just keeps on coming. So Grant doesn't stop and then retreat back to DC. He just keeps moving southward. And so Lee's like, oh no, I have to reattack. So Lee relocates. You have another battle here, and then you have a brutal battle at Cold Harbor. So North Anna and Cold Harbor are at Cold Harbor. The book even mentions this. They didn't have dog tags back then, but at Cold Harbor they would get a friend with paper and they would write their name on the paper and pin it to their coat. They didn't have dog tags because they knew they were going to get killed. One guy's diary said, today we fought the battle at Cold Harbor and I was killed. He wrote that in his diary, and he was killed. Like, he expected to be killed that day, and he was. So Grant is hurling tens of thousands of guys into these battles. There you can see Cold Harbor, this bloody engagement that just Lee matches him, out-strategizes him, but thousands of people are dying. And so, again, Grant gets this reputation of being the butcher. Now, Lee is losing enormous amounts of men. Per capita, he cannot replace them. And so that's what Grant wants. He doesn't want to have people dead, but he wants to grind Lee into submission. The last major battle, and by major I mean where people directly engage each other, is this battle of Cold Harbor. Because the next time the city of Petersburg is under attack, Grant has experience at fighting cities. By the way, Petersburg is south of Richmond. See Richmond? There's Petersburg, right? So Grant's just gone right on past it. Across the James, and now not far from us, okay? So at Petersburg, you'll see this battle starts in June of 64. June of 64. it doesn't end until April of 65 because Lee can't come out behind these fortifications. So if you ever wanted to study a pre-World War I battle that looked like World War I, it's the Battle of Petersburg. Because the Battle of Petersburg is a siege of trenches. And the Union is going to launch several attacks and be repulsed. But the people in Petersburg are like in Vicksburg, are practically, cut off. So you have one of the most momentous events of the war in terms of interest, for me, human interest. They've been coming up with strategies to try to get through these Confederate trenches, these Confederate defenses. So what they come up with is to use miners and to mine under the Confederate line and fill it with hundreds of pounds of TNT. And so they do. The Union puts all these TNT bombs under a Confederate position, and then they light the fuse. And it blows a giant hole in the defenses of the Confederate. I mean, a big hole. And it becomes known as the Battle of the Crater, all right, because it's a crater. And so once the hole and the smoke clears, the Union troops rush into it. And when they get about to, halfway through it, they realize there's a cliff wall from the crater that they can't climb. And the Confederates, once they've gotten their sort of, bearings, they look down and they see Union troops looking at them. And so they just start shooting them. And bodies just start piling up in the crater. And so the crater is a really terrible bloodshed period. But in the end, the siege, like the siege of Vicksburg, is successful. Lee has to surrender Petersburg. He has to leave it. He has to give it up. And if you're looking back at 65, you can see after Petersburg, they're retreating across the James River. Now, with the fall of Petersburg, Richmond is undefended. And that means Richmond falls. Richmond is defeated. During the fall of Richmond, Jefferson Davis will relocate the Confederate government to a town on the Richmond to Danville Railroad, right? And so he will take his cabinet, the Confederate cabinet, and put them on a train and come right down here, okay, to Danville. So when you look at when Danville served as the last capital of the Confederacy, it's right at the end of the siege of Petersburg, April 3rd to April 10th. The fall of Richmond, when Danville became the capital. And Jefferson Davis stayed here for a week. Okay, with, some people think the Confederate gold. And so if you've ever been to Main Street, Danville, you probably recognize this building. Quite a debate in the last couple of years when there was a Confederate flag flying there. People wanted it removed. The guys that owned the building wanted it removed. Or rent, not owned, but rented. So nonetheless, that's what happens there. So Lee is retreating, and he wants to hook up with Jefferson Davis in Danville. Danville was pretty well defended, and he wants to connect with the other Confederate army of Joseph Johnston, who's in Tennessee. He's being pursued by Sherman. Remember? So just make one super Confederate army, the Cumberland, and put them all together. So he's retreating back towards Danville. Okay, as he gets past, and Sailor's Creek is the last battle of the Confederacy here in the war. It's a small battle compared to some of these big ones. Grant is pursuing Lee all the way, right? So Lee wakes up on the morning of April the 8th, and he gets notification that there are Union troops coming this way. In other words, he's surrounded. Grant has gotten Union troops on both sides of it. All right? So he sends word to General Grant to pick a location where they can talk, about the end of the war. And Grant's men choose this house. It's a little post office stop. It's called Appomattox Courthouse, right? This is the guy's house who the Civil War started in his front yard. Wilmer McLean, like the guy at Manassas, lives at his house now that he's moved to Appomattox, right? And so Grant's men picked this, okay? Lee's men picked this, excuse me. And Lee is there waiting, and Grant comes up. He's mud spattered, typical Grant fashion, smoking a cigar. And Grant is very polite to Lee. He says, we met each other before. Lee said, I don't recall that. Thank you for telling me. And so Lee asks him, what is going to be, what are the terms for our surrender? Because what does he expect from Grant? He expects unconditional surrender, right? That's Grant's style. And Grant is very gracious. Now keep in mind, Grant and Lincoln are simpatico. Grant and Lincoln were like close once he came east. And Grant says your men can keep their horses. They can keep their long firearms for hunting. You know, they can, in other words, he doesn't take anything from them. And they should go home. And Lee's like, okay, I can accept that. Some of Lee's men want the army to be disbanded and fight a guerrilla war. You know, and Lee refuses to even acknowledge that as ungentlemanly, unhonorable, dishonorable, right? So with that, Lee surrenders to Grant. And the country is in jubilation, as you can imagine. You know, it's like, wow. The war doesn't technically end on this day, on April 9th. Technically, the Confederates in the North Carolina had to surrender too, which they did. All right, but it's a couple days later. Word gets back. Davis makes a run for it. All right, as do several other Confederate leaders. They'll be caught and put in jail initially. Okay, and Lincoln. Now here's the thing. Look at, there's the end of the war. So at the end of the war, Lincoln has been quiet. Like he hasn't actually made a speech yet. And his supporters, when they've gotten, not his supporters, America, in Washington, D.C., they demand that Lincoln come out and talk. You know, like, Lincoln, talk to us. You know, like, come out and celebrate your victory kind of thing, our victory. And so he's going to make a sort of, I mean, it was a speech he'd been working on, but it's kind of an impromptu speech, meaning on the spot, he gives this thing. All right. So let me change it all to red here so you can really read it better. Well, it wasn't fully, I mean, yes, to a degree it's improvised, but really it's, you know, if you know anything about presidential speeches, they take a while to take shape. So in other words, it's something he had already kind of written, but he doesn't give it as the speech that people expect. In other words, it's kind of both. It's impromptu, but it's the prepared impromptu, if that makes sense. So here's what he says. So this is the last time Abraham Lincoln will publicly address anybody. By our recent successes, right? The re-inauguration of the national authority. So here's where Lincoln's last speech, he's already talking about the future. He's not gloating. He's not saying, hey, we kicked the butt, we're awesome. You know, which is good. He says the focus should be on reconstruction. He's immediately ready for the next chapter. Lincoln wants to heal this and move on, which has had a large share of thought. It's pressed now fully upon us. We're now really paying attention because the war's over. The issue of reconstruction will be very difficult. Boy, did he get that right. No one man has authority to give up the rebellion for another man. In other words, just because Robert E. Lee surrendered didn't mean all those Confederate soldiers are in their mind surrendered. You understand? Nor is it a small embarrassment that we, the loyal people, differ among ourselves on how to do reconstruction. Guys, Abraham Lincoln, as a Republican, is having to deal with his own party's idea of what reconstruction is for. How should the post-war America look? I have been shown a letter in which the writer expresses regret that my mind has not seemed to be fixed on what to do with these so-called, I love it, so-called seceding states. All right? Are they in the Union or out of it? So in other words, you have Republicans, particularly the leadership of the Republicans in Congress, who believe that the southern states should be like conquered territory. Not states, but like defeated areas that the North can control. We all agree that the seceded states, so-called, are out of proper relation with the Union. That's improper relation. And the sole object of government in regards to the state is to get them into that. We want them back in the Union quickly. All right? I believe it's not only possible, but it's easy to do without deciding whether these states were ever in it or not. He's going to call it a sophism. You guys know what a sophism is? It's a smart sounding thing that's flawed. It's not logical. He says secession was a sophism. It was a manipulation. It was never a thing. But clearly, you know, something happened, a rebellion, an insurgency, whatever you would call it. So how do we fix that? So finding folks safely at home, it's really immaterial whether they were abroad, right? They're at home now. Whatever we're going to call their condition, they're back with us. Let us all join in doing the acts necessary to restore the practical relations between our states. and forever after indulged whether or not they were without or in the Union or not. He never accepted that, but he said, I don't want to fight an argument over whether or not they left the Union. It's irrelevant at this point. They're back. Okay? So then what? Now here's where, man, he's really going to rock some world. The amount of voters, so to speak, on which the new Louisiana government rests, so he knows of an example of a place that's already done reconstruction, somewhat. Louisiana. So that's what he's looking at, the state of Louisiana. What Louisiana did would be more satisfactory if it contained 50, 30, or even 20,000 instead of 12,000. So what he means by that is 12,000 people signed a loyalty oath, saying they were loyal to the Union. He preferred it to be much bigger. It is also unsatisfactory to some that the right to vote, like the franchise, is not given to the colored man. I myself prefer that it would be conferred on the intelligent and soldiers. So I think some black people should be able to vote. Soldiers, the veterans, and intelligent. I'm not sure how he would measure that, but you get the idea. Is he, by the way, there will be a guy in the audience, I'll tell you who it is in a minute, who says, that means the N-word suffrage. He'll never live to see the day, that guy says. The guy who's sitting in the office, who's in the crowd, who hears that, or standing, or sitting, who hears this, is named John Wilkes Booth. He's the guy who shoots Abraham Lincoln. Okay, so he hears him give this speech. Some 12,000 voters in the former slave state of Louisiana have sworn allegiance, held elections, built the government, created a constitution without slavery, given public schools to black and white people, allowed the legislature to let colored people vote. The legislature has voted and passed the 13th Amendment. So he's saying this looks really good. Now, if we reject this, we will disorganize them and disperse them. We in effect to say to them, you are worthless, or worse, we will not help you. To the blacks, we will say, we gave you the cup of liberty, right? And now we're taking that from you. So in other words, let's not undo this. Let's replicate this. Loyalty oath, 13th Amendment, let's make some schools and let black people vote, right? We recognize and sustain this government. Colored man, and seeing all united for him, is inspired with vigilance and energy and daring. They'll desire the right to vote. They'll soon make the advanced steps toward it. And see that the new government of Louisiana is only to what it should be as the egg is to the fowl. We shall sooner have the fowl by hatching it than smashing it. So Lincoln's last, by the way, that's not, in some ways, it's not a very inspiring speech. You know, it's not like the second inaugural. But in other ways, it's like, wow, he wants black suffrage as a right. And he wants the Confederate States quickly back into the Union. Everybody hear that? Quickly back into the Union. So we will see him not survive to see that on Monday. Okay? So let me stop now and see if there are any questions.